The American colonel slammed his fist on the map table so hard the coffee cups jumped. It was June 1968, and inside the Tactical Operations Center at Nui Dat, a confrontation was unfolding that would never appear in any official record. An Australian SAS captain had just told the senior American liaison officer that his five-man patrol intended to enter an area that MACV Command had explicitly designated as a free fire zone for B-52 arc light strikes. No ground forces were authorized inside the box, no exceptions. The American colonel made this abundantly clear. The area was scheduled for saturation bombing within 72 hours. Any personnel inside the grid square would be incinerated alongside the Viet Cong infrastructure the strikes were meant to destroy. The Australian captain listened, nodded politely, and said four words that would define a philosophy the United States military spent decades trying to understand. "We're going anyway." The colonel stared at him. In the American chain of command, this was insubordination of the highest order. In the Australian chain of command, it was Tuesday. What happened over the following 9 days inside that forbidden grid square would produce intelligence so valuable it altered the entire Allied operational picture in 3 core tactical zones. It would also produce a confrontation between 2 military cultures so fundamentally different that senior officers on both sides would spend the rest of their careers arguing about who was right, and it would expose a fault line running through the heart of the Vietnam War itself, the gap between rules written in air-conditioned offices and the reality faced by men who smelled like rotting vegetation and hadn't slept in 4 days. But to understand why those 4 words mattered, why an Australian Special Forces officer would look a full colonel in the eye and defy an order backed by the combined authority of the United States Military Assistance Command Vietnam, you have to understand something about the way the Australians fought this war, and you have to understand why the Americans, despite commanding the most powerful military machine in human history, kept getting it wrong. The story begins not in 1968, but 2 years earlier, when the first Australian SAS squadron stepped off a transport aircraft at Vung Tau and entered a war that would test everything they believed about themselves, when 3 Squadron of the Australian Special Air Service Regiment arrived in Phuoc Toi Province in June 1966. They carried with them a military tradition that had been forged in places most Americans had never heard of. The jungles of Borneo during the Indonesian confrontation, where SAS patrols had conducted secret cross-border operations into Indonesian territory, tracking communist insurgents through terrain so dense that visibility rarely exceeded 3 meters. The rubber plantations of Malaya during the emergency, where Australian soldiers had spent 12 years learning that a guerrilla war could not be won by conventional means, that the enemy lived among the people and could only be separated from them through patience, intelligence, and the kind of intimate knowledge of terrain that comes from walking it on foot, day after day, month after month. The scrublands of the Australian outback, where Aboriginal trackers had been teaching soldiers to read the earth like a book for generations, passing down 40,000 years of accumulated knowledge about how to move through hostile landscape without being detected, how to track a man by the moisture content of a disturbed leaf, how to smell human presence on a breeze that carried nothing but jungle rot to the untrained nose. These were not men who had learned warfare from textbooks. They had learned it from decades of small, brutal conflicts fought on the margins of empire, where there was never enough ammunition, never enough air support, never enough of anything except the enemy and the terrain that protected him. In Malaya, Australian forces had helped defeat a communist insurgency using methods that prefigured everything they would later employ in Vietnam. Small patrols operating deep in the jungle for extended periods, emphasis on intelligence gathering over body counts, integration of indigenous tracking skills into military operations, the development of what one Australian officer called a predatory patience, the ability to wait in absolute stillness for hours or days until the enemy revealed himself through a single careless moment. The American military advisory system that governed Allied operations in Vietnam was built on a simple premise. The United States provided the strategic framework, the firepower, the logistics, and the overarching command authority. Allied nations contributed forces that operated within this framework, following American rules of engagement, American operational procedures, and American definitions of what was permissible and what was not. For most Allied contingents, this arrangement was accepted without significant friction. The South Koreans, the Thai, the Filipino units all operated more or less within the boundaries Washington established. The Australians were different. From the moment the first Australian task force established itself at Nui Dat, senior Australian commanders had negotiated something unusual. They wanted their own tactical area of responsibility. They wanted to fight the war their way, using methods developed through their own experience, answering to their own chain of command for tactical decisions, even while operating under the broader operational control of U.S. Second Field Force Vietnam. The Americans agreed, partly because they needed the political symbolism of Allied participation, partly because Phuoc Tuy Province was considered a secondary theater not worth arguing about, and partly because nobody in the Pentagon imagined the Australians would actually do anything differently enough to matter. They were wrong about that last part. The differences began appearing almost immediately, and they alarmed American observers who witnessed them. Where American operations in Vietnam were built around the concept of search and destroy, using large formations supported by devastating firepower to find the enemy and annihilate him, the Australians operated on an entirely different principle. They believed the jungle was not an obstacle to be overcome with technology. It was an environment to be mastered through patience, discipline, and a willingness to become something other than a conventional soldier. Australian SAS patrols consisted of 5 men, not platoons, not companies. 5. They carried no radios powerful enough to call in airstrikes on their own authority. They moved at speeds that made American Special Operations personnel physically uncomfortable to observe. 100 meters per hour through dense jungle, sometimes less. A pace so slow that it seemed to violate every principle of military efficiency that American doctrine held sacred. At 100 meters per hour, a patrol that needed to cover 5 kilometers would take an entire week. To American commanders accustomed to helicopter-borne mobility and mechanized sweep operations, this was operationally absurd. But the tactical logic was brutal and irrefutable. American patrols moving at 2 to 3 kilometers per day created disturbances detectable from hundreds of meters away. Snapping branches, rustling leaves, subtle vibrations transmitted through root systems. Viet Cong listening posts were specifically trained to identify these signatures. A single broken twig could compromise an entire operation. At 100 meters per hour, no signature existed. The jungle soundscape recovered completely between each careful step. Birds kept singing. Insects kept droning. Monkeys continued their calls. To enemy listening posts, areas where Australians operated sounded perfectly normal. There was nothing to investigate, nothing to report, nothing to ambush. The Americans believed in speed, aggression, and the application of overwhelming force. These principles had won the Second World War. They had held the line in Korea. They had built the most formidable military apparatus the world had ever seen. And in the jungles of Southeast Asia, they were producing body counts that looked impressive in briefings, but did nothing to win the war. The Australians had a different metric for success. They measured effectiveness not in enemies killed, but in enemies who never knew they were there, not in territory seized, but in intelligence gathered, not in firepower expended, but in rounds not fired, because the patrol had positioned itself so perfectly that silence was more lethal than noise. This philosophy put them on a collision course with American rules of engagement from the very beginning. And nowhere was that collision more visible than in the way the two forces defined what constituted a permissible area of operations. The American system of managing the battlefield in Vietnam was extraordinarily complex. At any given moment, the landscape was carved into overlapping zones of control, free fire areas, restricted zones, no-fire zones, arc light boxes designated for B-52 strikes, artillery fan areas, and flight corridors. Each zone carried its own rules. Each rule had its own chain of approval. Each approval required coordination between multiple headquarters, sometimes spanning 3 or 4 echelons of command. The system existed for a reason. With hundreds of thousands of troops operating in a relatively compact theater, the risk of fratricide was enormous. American artillery could reach across province boundaries. B-52 strikes could devastate areas the size of small towns. Without rigorous coordination, Allied forces would destroy each other as efficiently as they destroyed the enemy. The Australians understood the logic. They did not dispute the necessity of coordination. What they disputed was the assumption that coordination required subordination, that the American system of managing the battlefield should dictate where Australian patrols could and could not go when the intelligence picture demanded otherwise. The specific incident that June night in 1968 involved a grid square in the northern reaches of Phuoc Toi Province, where the long high mountains descended into a network of valleys and stream beds that served as infiltration routes for Viet Cong forces moving between base areas. Australian SAS patrols had been tracking enemy movement through this corridor for weeks. They had identified patterns suggesting a major resupply operation was underway, with porters carrying weapons and ammunition from cache sites in the mountains to forward staging areas closer to populated villages. The intelligence was time-sensitive. If the Australians could get a patrol into the corridor during the next movement window, they could confirm the route, identify the destination, and provide targeting data that would allow the task force to interdict the supply line at its most vulnerable point. The problem was that MACV had designated the entire grid square as an arc light box. A flight of B-52 Stratofortresses based in Guam was scheduled to saturate the area with 500-pound and 750-pound bombs in a mission intended to destroy suspected Viet Cong tunnel complexes in the hillsides. The strike had been planned weeks in advance. The coordination had been completed through channels that ran from Saigon to Pacific Command in Hawaii to Strategic Air Command in Omaha. Canceling or rescheduling the strike would require unwinding a bureaucratic chain that stretched halfway around the world. The Australian position was straightforward. The B-52 strikes had been hitting these mountains for 2 years. They had dropped tens of thousands of tons of ordnance on the long high slopes, and the Viet Cong D-445 battalion was still there. still operating, still launching attacks, still using the tunnel systems that the bombs were supposed to destroy. The D-445 was the unit that haunted Phuoc Toi province like a persistent fever. Formed in May 1965, the Provincial Mobile Battalion recruited principally from the villages of Dat Do, Long Dien, and Hoa Long. It had fought at the Battle of Long Tan in August 1966, where it supported the 275th Regiment in what became the most famous engagement of the Australian War. It had survived every operation mounted against it, every bombing campaign, every sweep and clear mission. The Long Hai Mountains, a range of jungle-covered limestone extending toward the South China Sea, were its sanctuary. The Viet Cong had not simply dug into these mountains, they had become part of them, expanding cave systems and tunnel networks that had been under construction for over 2 decades. Underground rivers carved through the limestone provided water. Ventilation shafts, disguised as animal burrows, supplied fresh air. Storage chambers deep inside the rock held enough weapons, ammunition, and medical supplies to sustain operations for months without resupply. American military planners had tried everything against the Long Hais. Helicopter assaults were suicide given the anti-aircraft positions covering every approach. Ground operations produced casualties from the mines and booby traps that riddled every path leading into the hills. B-52 arc light strikes created spectacular destruction on the surface, while the Viet Cong waited out the bombardment in chambers designed to withstand anything short of a direct hit from a bunker buster. The strikes were not working. They had never worked against the deep cave complexes that honeycombed the limestone formations. What might work was precise human intelligence gathered by men on the ground who could see what satellites and reconnaissance aircraft could not. But only if those men were allowed to go where the intelligence demanded. The American position was equally straightforward. Rules existed for a reason. If Australian patrols entered an active arc light box, they risked annihilation from their own side's bombs. Beyond the physical danger, allowing one Allied unit to ignore deconfliction procedures would undermine the entire system that prevented fratricide across the theater. The precedent was unacceptable. The risk was unacceptable. The answer was no. The Australian captain left the operations center and briefed his patrol commander. They would enter the grid square from the southeast, using a stream bed that provided covered approach into the valley floor. They would time their insertion to arrive well before the arc light window, conduct their reconnaissance, and extract before the bombers arrived. If the strike was moved forward without warning, they would shelter in one of the many limestone caves that pocked the hillsides, the same caves that had been protecting Viet Cong fighters from American bombs for years. The 5-man patrol departed Nui Dat before dawn. They carried no identification that could link them to the Australian task force. Their weapons were the modified L1A1, self-loading rifles that horrified American ordnance specialists, barrels shortened by 15 centimeters, flash suppressors removed, crude forward grips welded from scrap metal. The standard L1A1 was one of the finest battle rifles ever manufactured, a variant of the legendary FN-FAL, accurate to 400 meters and respected by militaries worldwide. The Australians had turned it into something that looked like a weapon assembled by desperate partisans in an occupied country. American weapons experts who examined these modifications called them barbaric. They had destroyed the ballistics. They had reduced effective range by at least 60%. They had created something loud, inaccurate, and apparently unprofessional. But in the Vietnamese jungle, where average visibility was between 10 and 15 meters, a rifle accurate to 400 meters was useless when you could not see past 15. Worse, the full-length barrel constantly snagged on vines, bamboo, and undergrowth. Every snag required stopping. Every stop created noise. Every noise could mean detection. The shortened weapon slid through vegetation without catching, and the 7.62 millimeter round it fired, even from a shortened barrel, delivered stopping power the American 5.56 millimeter M16 could not match at close range. Their feet were wrapped in rubber cut from automobile tires, leaving footprints indistinguishable from Viet Cong sandals. A Viet Cong tracker who found these prints would assume he was following friendly forces. He would not raise alarm. He would not call for ambush teams. He might even walk directly into the Australian patrol, believing he was meeting comrades. They had not used soap, deodorant, or any commercial hygiene product in 2 weeks. They smelled like the jungle floor because that was the doctrine, and the doctrine was the reason Australian SAS patrols achieved kill ratios that made American intelligence analysts question their own data. The Viet Cong had confirmed in interrogation after interrogation that American patrols could be detected by smell from over 500 meters away. The chemical signature of American hygiene products was completely alien to the jungle environment. Deodorant created scent trails lingering for hours in humid air. American cigarettes, with their distinctive sweet Virginia tobacco, announced patrol positions to any enemy scout within a kilometer. The Australians had eliminated every marker until they smelled exactly like the environment that concealed them. They entered the grid square on the second morning and immediately began finding what the B-52s had missed. Not tunnel entrances, not weapons caches, something far more valuable. They found a trail network so well camouflaged that it was invisible from the air. Paths beaten into the jungle floor by hundreds of feet over months of use, hidden beneath canopy so thick that even the most advanced aerial photography registered nothing but undifferentiated green. Along these trails they found way stations, small cleared areas where porters could rest, redistribute loads, and continue movement. They found message drops, hollow bamboo tubes inserted into the earth at precise angles that indicated direction of travel and time since last passage to any Viet Cong courier who knew how to read them. On the third day, they found the distribution point, a small clearing at the junction of 3 trails where supplies were being sorted and redirected to multiple destinations. They observed the site for 11 hours without moving, without eating, without any of the normal human activities that might alert a sentry to their presence. They counted 37 porters passing through during that single observation period. They documented the loads being carried. They noted the direction each porter departed. They recorded the timing of arrivals and departures, which revealed a scheduling system more sophisticated than anything Allied intelligence had predicted. On the 4th day, they found something that changed the entire operational picture. A trail branch that did not lead toward any known Viet Cong base area. It led southeast toward the populated coastal villages that the Australian task force was responsible for securing. Following this trail at their agonizing pace, they discovered a cache site less than 3 kilometers from a village that Australian civil affairs teams had been working with for months. The cache contained not just weapons and ammunition, but propaganda materials, medical supplies, and financial records that revealed the Viet Cong's tax collection apparatus in minute detail. The records showed exactly which village officials were cooperating with the insurgency. Exactly how much rice and money was being extracted from each hamlet, and exactly which families were providing sons and daughters to the guerrilla forces. This was intelligence that no bomb could have produced. No amount of high explosive dropped from 30,000 feet could have revealed the names of collaborators, the amounts of taxation, the organizational structure of the shadow government that controlled the countryside after dark. This was the kind of intelligence that wins counterinsurgency wars, the kind that allows you to dismantle an enemy's political infrastructure rather than merely cratering the jungle above his tunnels. The patrol extracted on the 9th day, less than 18 hours before the arc light strike finally arrived. The B-52s dropped their bombs precisely on schedule. The explosions were felt at Nui Dat, 30 kilometers away. Post-strike aerial photography showed the expected pattern of craters and shattered vegetation. The Viet Cong tunnel complex, which had survived every previous strike, survived this one too. What followed was a confrontation at a level well above the tactical. The Australian task force commander was informed that his SAS had violated a MACV directive by entering an active arc light box. A formal protest was filed through American channels. Demands were made for disciplinary action against the officers responsible. The Australian response was to present the intelligence haul from the 9-day patrol, which included the trail network mapping, the Porter traffic analysis, the cache site discovery, and the financial records that would allow targeted operations against the Viet Cong political infrastructure in 6 separate hamlets. The intelligence was so valuable that it was immediately classified at the highest levels and distributed to every Allied headquarters in 3 corps. American intelligence analysts who examined the material described it as one of the most significant single patrol intelligence collections of the entire war. The trail network mapping alone was worth more than months of aerial reconnaissance. The Porter traffic analysis revealed logistical patterns that no electronic sensor array had detected. The financial records from the cache site provided what counterinsurgency theorists call the keys to the kingdom, the names, relationships, and organizational structures that allow a military force to dismantle an insurgency from the inside rather than merely bombing its visible manifestations from the outside. Operations launched on the basis of this intelligence over the following 3 months resulted in the identification and neutralization of over 40 Viet Cong operatives embedded in the civilian population. Village officials who had been secretly channeling rice and money to the guerrillas were identified and confronted. Supply networks that had been feeding guerrilla operations for years were disrupted at their source, not through bombing, but through the targeted operations that only precise intelligence could enable. The measurable decline in enemy-initiated contacts throughout southern Phuoc Tuy province that followed could be traced directly to the 9 days 5 men had spent inside a grid square that American rules said they could not enter. The contrast with the arc light strike that followed could not have been more instructive. The B-52s delivered their payload precisely on schedule, each aircraft carrying over 50,000 pounds of ordnance, the combined destructive force capable of leveling a square kilometer of forest. The ground shook at Nui Dat. The blast signatures registered on seismic monitors. Post-strike reconnaissance showed the expected moonscape of craters and splintered timber. And within a week, the Viet Cong were moving through the strike zone again, following the same trails, using the same tunnel complexes, carrying the same supplies to the same destinations. The bombs had rearranged the surface of the earth without changing anything that mattered beneath it. The formal protest was quietly withdrawn. No disciplinary action was taken, but the incident crystallized something that had been building since the first Australian boots hit Vietnamese soil. The two allies were fighting the same war with fundamentally incompatible philosophies, and the rules designed to govern that war were sometimes the very things preventing it from being won. This was not an isolated incident. Throughout the Australian deployment in Vietnam, SAS patrols repeatedly pushed the boundaries of what American rules of engagement permitted. They operated in areas designated for airstrikes. They conducted patrols that extended beyond their authorized sector boundaries when the intelligence trail demanded it. They employed methods that American military lawyers would have flagged as problematic if they had ever been subjected to the same legal scrutiny applied to U.S. forces. The pattern was consistent enough to constitute an unwritten doctrine of its own. When intelligence indicated significant enemy activity in an area that bureaucratic restrictions placed off limits, Australian commanders made a calculation that American commanders were culturally unable to make. They weighed the value of the intelligence against the risk of institutional friction, and they chose the intelligence every time. Not recklessly, not blindly. They planned meticulously to mitigate the physical dangers. They timed their movements to avoid scheduled bombardments. They established communication protocols to deconflict with air operations. But they did not allow the coordination machinery to become a veto on operational necessity. American liaison officers assigned to the Australian task force filed reports about these boundary violations with varying degrees of alarm. Some were scandalized. Others were quietly impressed. A few requested transfers, not because they feared the Australians, but because witnessing the gap between Australian effectiveness and American methodology forced them to confront uncomfortable questions about the war they were fighting. One American officer, after observing Australian SAS operations over several months, submitted a report to his chain of command that concluded with a recommendation so blunt it was immediately classified. The recommendation was that American Special Operations units should be granted the same degree of tactical autonomy that the Australians enjoyed. The recommendation was noted. It was filed. It was not acted upon for nearly 2 decades. The Australians operated under their own rules of engagement, issued by the Australian government, which differed from MOCV directives in ways that were sometimes subtle and sometimes dramatic. Australian rules gave field commanders more latitude in deciding when and how to engage the enemy. They permitted offensive ambush operations that American units in similar circumstances would have required higher headquarters approval to execute. They allowed Australian patrols to remain in the field for extended periods, making tactical decisions on the ground without the constant reference back to a chain of command that characterized American operations. This autonomy was not accidental. It was the product of deliberate negotiation between Canberra and Washington, driven by Australian military leaders who understood from decades of experience that small unit jungle warfare could not be effectively commanded from a headquarters miles away. The men on the ground had to have the authority to act on what they saw, heard, and sensed in real time. Waiting for permission from a distant command post meant waiting for the opportunity to vanish. The selection process that produced these men was itself a statement of philosophy. Australian SAS selection did not begin with physical tests. It began with psychological evaluation. Candidates were assessed for a specific personality profile: high pain tolerance, low need for social validation, above-average pattern recognition, and what psychologists termed predatory patience. the ability to remain motionless for hours while maintaining complete situational awareness, the willingness to act with explosive violence after extended periods of inactivity, the capacity to function independently in environments where help was days away. Only 1 in 12 candidates who began selection completed it. Those who passed entered a training program lasting 18 months, 3 times longer than U.S. Army Special Forces training of the same era. A significant portion of that training took place not in jungle warfare schools, but in the Australian outback, learning tracking techniques from Aboriginal instructors whose methods had never been written down, methods refined through 40,000 years of survival in one of the most demanding wilderness environments on Earth. The result was soldiers who did not merely operate in the jungle. They inhabited it. They moved through triple canopy vegetation the way a farmer moves through his own paddock, with familiarity, confidence, and an almost proprietary sense of ownership. American observers who witnessed SAS training described a quality they struggled to articulate. The Australians were not anxious in the bush. They were not frustrated or afraid. They appeared comfortable in an environment that made most Western soldiers psychologically claustrophobic. This comfort was not bravado. It was the product of a training regime that deliberately transformed the jungle from a hostile environment into a home. The results spoke in a language that transcended bureaucratic arguments. Between 1966 and 1971, Australian SAS squadrons conducted nearly 1,200 patrols in Vietnam. They inflicted over 500 confirmed enemy killed. Their own losses were staggeringly low. Just 1 man killed in action, 1 who died of wounds, 3 killed accidentally, and 1 missing in action, presumed dead. The Viet Cong, who had given American forces dismissive tactical nicknames and treated them as a dangerous but predictable enemy, gave the Australians a different designation entirely. Ma Rung, the phantoms of the jungle ghosts, and the operational guidance captured in enemy documents told a story that no statistical analysis could convey with equal force. Against Americans, the Viet Cong recommended aggressive ambush at carefully selected locations, inflicting maximum casualties before withdrawing through prepared routes. Against Australians, the guidance was a single word that carried more weight than entire chapters of tactical doctrine: avoidance. The irony was profound. The most powerful military on Earth generated a recommended response of attack. A force of barely 500 men from a country most Americans could not find on a map generated a recommended response of avoidance. And the reason was not that the Australians were braver or tougher or better equipped. The reason was that they had been willing to fight the war the jungle demanded rather than the war their institutions preferred. This willingness extended beyond smell discipline, beyond modified weapons, beyond enemy sandals and patient movement. It extended to a fundamental rejection of the idea that the battlefield could be managed from above, that rules written by staff officers in Saigon could account for the infinite complexity of a counterinsurgency fought in triple canopy jungle against an enemy who had been living in that jungle for 20 years. The Australians believed that the man with his face in the mud was better positioned to make tactical decisions than the general studying acetate overlays in an air-conditioned briefing room. And every time an Australian patrol defied a boundary, ignored a restriction, or entered a zone that American doctrine declared off-limits, they were not being reckless. They were expressing a philosophical conviction that had been validated by decades of operational experience. The war on the ground does not conform to the lines on the map. The American military learned this lesson. It just took them a very long time. When the United States began its wholesale transformation of Special Operations Forces in the 1980s, building the structures that would eventually produce Delta Force, expanding the SEAL teams, creating the Joint Special Operations Command. The principles they codified bore a remarkable resemblance to what Australian SAS operators had been practicing in Vietnam. Decentralized command authority, small unit autonomy, the primacy of human intelligence over technological sensors, the willingness to adapt methods to environment rather than forcing the environment to accommodate the method. Officers who had served alongside the Australians in Vietnam were among the most vocal advocates for these reforms. They had seen what was possible when trained men were given the authority to act on their own judgment. They had also seen what happened when those same men were constrained by rules that prioritized institutional comfort over operational reality. Some of those officers had witnessed Australian SAS patrols return from missions that American doctrine said were impossible. They had seen 5-man teams produce intelligence hauls that entire battalions supported by air cavalry and artillery could not match. They had watched Australian operators move through jungle terrain in complete silence, covering 50 meters in 30 minutes without producing a sound detectable from 15 meters away. And they had read the captured enemy documents that confirmed what the field evidence suggested, that a force smaller than a single American rifle company had generated more fear among the Viet Cong than divisions of conventionally deployed troops. Some members of the Australian SAS even served directly with American Special Operations during the war. Australian personnel worked alongside U.S. Army Special Forces and provided instructors to the MACV Recondo School, teaching the very reconnaissance and patrol techniques that American units were struggling to master. Some individuals served on exchange with MACV SOG units, the highly classified studies and observations group that ran covert cross-border operations into Laos and Cambodia. In these joint assignments, the cultural gap between the two forces became starkly visible. American SOG operators were among the finest unconventional warfare practitioners the United States had ever produced. Yet even they noted that the Australians brought something to the field that American training had not been able to replicate: an ease in the jungle, a patience in the hide, an almost preternatural ability to sense the enemy before any physical evidence of his presence became apparent. The Australian approach carried costs that should not be minimized. Operating outside the formal coordination framework increased the risk of fratricide. Patrols that entered arc light boxes were gambling with their own lives in ways that no risk assessment could fully justify. The autonomy that made Australian operations effective also made them harder to control, harder to integrate into the broader Allied campaign, and harder to account for when things went wrong. And things did go wrong. The same culture that produced the jungle ghosts also produced incidents that Australian authorities spent decades classifying and minimizing. Operations in the long high mountains cost lives when patrols encountered the extensive minefields and booby traps that riddled the approaches. Operation Hammersley in February 1970, the largest Australian operation into the Long Highs, resulted in 12 men killed and 59 wounded, many from mines rather than direct enemy contact. The mountains exacted a toll in blood that no amount of tactical skill could entirely prevent. The psychological toll was equally devastating, measured not in immediate casualties, but in the slow unraveling of men who had spent months in a state of constant predatory hypervigilance. Operating at 100 meters per hour for weeks in enemy territory required a transformation that left permanent marks on those who underwent it. The absolute suppression of normal human impulses, the constant awareness that a single footfall could mean death, the knowledge that detection meant not just personal destruction, but the destruction of 4 comrades who depended on your silence, created psychological patterns that did not reverse when the patrol ended. Veterans described the experience of becoming what the jungle demanded as a kind of shedding. Human minds generate constant internal noise, plans, anxieties, memories, anticipations. This noise is invisible to us because it is so constant, but it shapes behavior in ways that skilled observers can detect. A person thinking about tomorrow moves differently than a person existing entirely in the present moment. The Australians learned to eliminate this noise entirely, to exist in a state of pure sensory awareness for days without the normal operations of human consciousness. This state was tactically invaluable. It made them invisible in ways that physical concealment alone could not achieve. An enemy scout might look directly at a concealed Australian position and see nothing unusual because the Australian occupying that position was generating no behavioral signals for the scout to detect. But this state was not something that could be switched off when the helicopter carried them back to Nui Dat. Post-traumatic stress rates among Australian Vietnam veterans would eventually exceed those of their American counterparts, despite serving in smaller numbers and sustaining fewer casualties. The same transformation that made them devastatingly effective operators made them strangers in their own communities. They had learned to think like predators, to suppress the emotional openness that human relationships require, to exist in a constant state of sensory alertness that civilian life neither demanded nor could accommodate. The Viet Cong called them Ma Rung, jungle ghosts. But ghosts are creatures caught between worlds, neither fully present in one realm nor able to return to another. Some of those men never found their way back completely. This was the hidden cost of those 4 words. We're going anyway. The willingness to do what the mission demanded, regardless of what the rules permitted, regardless of what headquarters approved, regardless of what the institutional machinery of the war tried to impose, came from a place deeper than tactical calculation. It came from a conviction that the men on the ground bore ultimate responsibility for the outcome, and that no rule designed to manage the bureaucracy of war should prevent them from fulfilling that responsibility. The American colonel who slammed his fist on that map table in June 1968 was not wrong about the risks. He was not wrong about the importance of coordination. He was not wrong about the precedent that was being set. But he was wrong about something more fundamental. He was wrong about which kind of failure was more dangerous, the failure to follow the rules or the failure to accomplish the mission. The Australians answered that question every time they walked into the jungle, and the answer they gave, written not in regulations but in results, in intelligence gathered and lives saved, and enemies who learned to fear the phantoms more than the bombers, shaped the future of special operations warfare in ways that are still being felt today. The captured Viet Cong documents said it plainly. Do not engage the Australians unless absolutely necessary. Do not attempt ambush because they are more likely to detect the trap than to walk into it. Do not attempt pursuit because their capabilities make such efforts futile and potentially fatal. If contact is unavoidable, break it off as quickly as possible and withdraw. This was not written about a force of 500,000. This was written about a force that never numbered more than a few hundred men at any given time. Men who violated rules of engagement not because they were undisciplined, but because they understood something that the rule-makers did not. In a counterinsurgency war fought in jungles so dense that visibility rarely exceeded 15 meters, the most dangerous thing you can do is follow rules designed for a different kind of war. We're going anyway. 4 words. The entire Australian philosophy of warfare compressed into a single sentence. The refusal to let institutional machinery override human judgment. The conviction that the men closest to the problem are best positioned to solve it. The understanding that war is not a managed process, but a violent confrontation with reality, and reality does not organize itself according to staff college templates. The B-52s dropped their bombs on schedule. The craters were photographed, measured, and filed in the archives of a war that was already being lost. The tunnel complex survived, as it always had. The Viet Cong emerged from their shelters, brushed off the dust, and resumed operations as they always did. But somewhere in the intelligence vaults of the 1st Australian Task Force, the product of 9 days spent inside a forbidden zone told a different story. Names of collaborators, routes of supply, structures of shadow government, the architecture of an insurgency laid bare by 5 men who smelled like death and moved like shadows and answered to a tradition older than the war that surrounded them. 500 confirmed enemy killed, 1,200 patrols, 1 man lost to enemy action, Ma Rung, the phantoms of the jungle, the soldiers who were told they could not go and went anyway, the men who proved that in the space between the rules and the reality, between the map and the terrain, between what headquarters permits and what the mission demands, there exists a kind of warfare that no amount of institutional resistance can suppress, because the jungle does not care about your rules of engagement. The jungle rewards what works, and for 6 years in the provinces of South Vietnam, what worked was 5 men in enemy sandals carrying sawed-off rifles, moving at 100 meters per hour through vegetation that should have made movement impossible, gathering intelligence that bombers could never produce, fighting a war their allies refused to learn from until decades after it was lost. That was the Australian way. Not better resourced, not technologically superior, not supported by the industrial might of a superpower. Just 5 men, a willingness to become what the environment demanded, and 4 words that contained more tactical wisdom than entire libraries of military doctrine. We're going anyway. The Pentagon classified the intelligence. The formal protest disappeared into bureaucratic archives. The B-52s kept bombing the same mountains. The tunnels kept surviving. The war kept being lost. But the lessons kept being proven correct. Every patrol that entered the forbidden zones and returned with intelligence the bombing could not produce. Every ambush that achieved results the airstrikes could not match. Every Viet Cong document that named the Australians as the one enemy to be avoided at all costs. The evidence accumulated year after year, patrol after patrol, in a province that most of the American High Command considered an afterthought, and the institutions that should have been learning were instead classifying, filing, and forgetting, choosing the comfort of familiar doctrine over the discomfort of evidence that demanded change. 50 years later, the Special Air Service Regiment's Heritage Room in Perth contains artifacts from those patrols. Modified rifles with their shortened barrels, the weapons that American ordnance officers called barbaric and Australian operators, called perfectly designed for the environment where they would actually be used, rubber sandals cut from tire treads, the footwear that turned 5 Western soldiers into 5 phantom Viet Cong on the trail, navigation maps marked with patrol routes that crossed into zones where Australian forces were not supposed to be, each line a small act of defiance against a system that prioritized procedural compliance over operational results. Patrol reports written in the terse, understated language of men who had spent weeks in conditions that would have broken most human beings, reports that documented intelligence collections of extraordinary value obtained through methods that no official directive had authorized. Each artifact tells the same story. Each artifact carries the same message. The rules said no. The mission said yes. The Australians chose the mission, and the jungle, which cared nothing for rank or nationality or the bureaucratic architecture of a war being managed from the other side of the Pacific Ocean, proved them right. Ma Rung, the jungle ghosts, the soldiers who went where they were told they could not go, did what they were told they could not do, and came home with proof that everything the most powerful military on earth believed about this war was wrong. 4 words, 1 philosophy, a legacy that outlasted the war, outlasted the institutions that tried to suppress it, and outlasted the comfortable assumptions of men who believed that rules could substitute for judgment in a conflict where the only rule that mattered was survival. We're going anyway. The Viet Cong understood what that meant. The Pentagon took decades to figure it out. Some would argue they still haven't.